much of rock and roll was born in some pretty, crappy places. Dark and dirty and smelly clubs where washroom was more of a distant, abstract idea instead of an actual room with plumbing and sanitary facilities. There was the Cavern Club in Liverpool, a favorite venue of the Beatles back in the day, but it closed down in the early 1970s. Now, there's still a Cavern Club at more or less the same address, but it's not the original. Over on Oxford Street, there was the 100 Club, a tiny jazz club in a basement that was invaded by the Sex Pistols and their ilk in the 1970s. It's still there. There's the Whiskey A Go-Go on Sunset Boulevard in West Hollywood. It's still there, too, operating as it always had since January of 1963. Toronto had the El Macambo on Spadina Avenue. That neon palm tree stood outside Canada's favorite scuzzy rock bar starting in 1958. But the most famous, or infamous club of all, was in the south end of Manhattan. It's so famous that it appears as a dot on a lot of tourist maps of New York City. For more than 30 years, this club jealously guarded its reputation as the birthplace of punk rock. But the lease came up at the end of August 2005, and the eviction notice was delivered on September the 7th. Everybody up. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. Last call at CBGB.
Now, the ongoing history of new music.
The Ramones, and Sheena is a punk rocker from 1978. No one really knows how many times they played that song from the tiny stage at CBGB, but they played it a lot. How much? Well, if you look a block north, you'll see a street sign declaring Joey Ramone Place. The Ramones performed at the club so much that the city named the street next door after the singer. He lived in an unassuming apartment not too far away, number 10J at 115 East 9th Street. There's now a walking tour that actually starts at Joey Ramone's apartment building's front door. Joey and the rest of the Ramones, along with a bunch of other bands that we're going to hear, helped give birth to a small scene in the club, which eventually spread like a virus to pretty much every corner of the planet. Welcome to the show. I'm Alan Cross, and this is the second half of a tribute to CBGB, the tiny, scuzzy, filthy, rat-infested slice of punk rock heaven at 315 Bowery at the dead end of Bleecker. The legends and the myths say that CBGB is the birthplace of punk rock, and by extension and extrapolation, most of what we call new rock and alternative rock today. And then came the summer of 2005. After a series of court cases and rallies, CBGB, the world's most famous punk club, was officially homeless. And here's the weird part. It was evicted by the homeless, or more correctly, a charity that cares for the homeless in this tough part of New York City. What we're going to do on this show is take a further look at the history and legacy of CBGB, or more correctly, the legacy of the people who hung around the bar and just didn't go home, or maybe had no place to go. On part one, we talked about how a new group called Television convinced the owner, an ex-Marine named Hilly Crystal, to let them play on Sundays in early 1973. And after a nearby venue fell down, literally collapsed into rubble, CBGB became the neighborhood haunt for a growing number of artists and musicians who had moved to that end of the city seeking ultra-cheap rents. After Television came the Ramones, then Patti Smith, and then Blondie, and the Talking Heads. Each of them went on to do big things in their own way around the world. But you could always trace everything back to this one small stage in this one small club. Now take the Ramones, for example. They used CBGB as a base of operations when they were refining their thing in the early days. As hard as it might be to envision today, their bubblegum rock at the speed and volume of a jet plane was about the most radical thing that anyone had ever heard back in the middle 70s. And you either loved it, because you got the joke, or you hated it, because you didn't. Mainstream rock fans and mainstream radio did not get the Ramones. But the kids in England, looking for a sound to call their own, well, they understood. In the spring of 1976, the first Ramones album was released. On July 4th, 1976, they played the Roundhouse, an old venue in Camden in the north part of London. They opened for a group called the Flamin' Groovies, and they shared the opening slot with the Stranglers. About 2,000 kids showed up. In the crowd were current and future Sex Pistols, future members of The Clash, Generation X, The Damned, Susie and the Banshees, and The Pretenders. If the UK punk rock scene has a birth date, it was that night at the Roundhouse where the Ramones taught this new alternative nation how to get it done. Sometimes with a song that didn't need to be more than 91 seconds. The Ramones doing the Johnny Appleseed thing by spreading the gospel of punk rock to the UK with a single performance at the Roundhouse on July 4th, 1976. You know how I mentioned that the Sex Pistols were there? Johnny Rotten managed to get backstage, and apparently while no one was looking, he secretly peed in the Ramones' beer. I don't know why, it just seemed to be the punk rock thing to do. Anyway, back to New York. CBGB became this hangout for like-minded punk rock types, with so many interesting people constantly jammed into a room that was 167 feet long and just 25 feet wide. There was a free and easy exchange of concepts and ideas and inspiration and body fluids. For a few years, especially between 1975 and 1977, CBGB was one hot, sweaty incubator of new rock. Take the case of Blondie. They evolved out of a female-fronted group called the Stilettos. They were pretty campy and vaudeville-like and really didn't last all that long. But then they broke up and reformed with one of the backup singers down front. Back in the day, there was not a more striking or beautiful woman in all of punk rock. Deborah Harry was a great singer and a great performer, and because she looked so awesome, she became this lightning rod for attention. By 1978, Blondie not only had signed to a major record label, but were having a string of mainstream hit singles and selling millions and millions of albums. Not bad for a group who used to watch everyone shoot heroin in the bathroom at CBGB. In a normal program, this is where they would play Blondie's biggest hit, which is Heart of Glass. Now, we could do that here, but that would be way too obvious. Instead, let's do something a little bit different. Let me play you the demo version. This is the original version of how the song used to sound. Okay? Here you go. When it was written, it was called Once I Had a Love. Later, it became the big disco hit, Heart of Glass.
Mistrust, love's gone behind. Was our love, it was divine. Soon found out I was losing my mind. Seemed like the real thing, and I was so blind. Mucha mistrust, love's gone behind. In between, what I find is pleasing and I'm feeling fine. Love is so confusing, there's no peace of mind. If I fear I'm losing you, it's just no good. You teasing like you
Blondie with the long-lost original version of their worldwide disco-fied hit, Heart of Glass. The Talking Heads also used CBGB to start their careers. David Byrne, the guitarist and singer, Chris Frantz, the drummer, and Tina Weymouth, the bass player, were all students at the Rhode Island School of Design. And between classes, they played in a group called the Artistics. In 1975, they decided to dump art school in favor of moving to the scuzzy part of New York. And once they got there, they heard about CBGB, and they managed to weasel their way onto an opening slot for the Ramones, which was their live debut. The date was June 20th, 1975, and the poster out front read, Ramones! With the Talking Heads. By early 1977, things had changed. The Talking Heads were one of the biggest regular draws at CBGB. A couple of labels were sniffing around. The band was also working on a couple of songs with two different producers, one of which, Tommy Erdaly, the real name of Ramones drummer Tommy Ramone, and the other was Tony Bongiovi. He's a relative of a guy who would later make $1 squillion into the name John Bon Jovi. From March 7th, 1977, this is the first ever Talking Heads single. It's called Love Building on Fire.
My love stands next to your love. I can't compare love when it's not love. It's not love. It's not love. Which is my face, which is a building, which is on fire, on fire. When my love stands next to your love, I can't define love when it's not love. It's not love. It's not love. Which is my face, which is a building, which is on fire. I've got two loves. They go tweet, 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 tweet like little birds. They're my two loves. And they go tweet, 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 tweet like little birds. They're my two loves. Which is a building, which is on fire, on fire. When my love stands next to your love, I can't define love when it's not love. It's not love. It's not love. Which is my face, which is a building, which is on fire.
The very first Talking Heads single, made possible by playing all those nights on the tiny stage at CBGB in New York. The Heads would later go on to become one of the most successful American post-punk bands. Their use of rhythm and production set the standard for a whole new generation of groups. So, once again, we've covered the ultra-major bands from the early days at CBGB, the Talking Heads, Blondie, and the Ramones. But three bands do not a legend make. There were many, many others who contributed to this myth, although unless you're hardcore, you may not know them. Some of the lesser-known, yet still vitally important CBGB groups, coming up next.
This is the ongoing history of new music. You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music.
On part one of this show, we looked at some of the more famous players in the CBGB myth. Blondie may have sold tens of millions of records, but they would have gotten nowhere had it not been for their time at the club. Same thing with the Talking Heads. They went from playing that same small stage to becoming one of the most influential of all the American new wave groups in the 1980s. And the Ramones? Well, I think we've established their role in all this. But there were also other CBGB characters who need to be recognized for their contributions. They never got rich, but they did make music richer. Take the case of Richard Hell, a guy who treated the club like his living room. He had been in the band Television, but got forced out for a variety of reasons. Now, Richard was dirt poor. He could not afford new clothes, so he wore what he had until they literally fell apart. And when they did fall apart, he just hold his clothes together with safety pins that he borrowed from friends. Around November of 1975, the manager of a clothing store from London, who was trying desperately to break into band management, saw Richard at CBGB. He didn't know Richard was just trying to hold it together with the safety pins. He thought Richard was making some sort of brilliant deconstructionist fashion statement. So it came to pass that Malcolm McLaren, future manager of the Sex Pistols, went back to his clothing store in London and started making and selling safety pin accessorized clothing with his future fashion design star partner Vivienne Westwood. And that's how the safety pin look became such a big deal with the British punk rockers of the late 1970s. It was all because of poor Richard Hell and the fact that he couldn't afford to buy new clothes.
I was saying, let me out of here before we're even born is such a gamble when you get away. It's fascinating to observe what the mirror does. And when I died into the world, I celebrate. I belong to the blank generation. I can take it or leave it in time. Well, I belong to the generation. I can take it or leave it in Triangles were falling out the window as the doctor came. He was a cartoon long forsaken by the public eye. The nurse adjusted her garters as I breathed my first. The doctor grabbed my throat and said, God, but the lady cried. I belong to the blank generation. I can take it or leave it in time. Well, I belong to the I can take it or leave it in time. Take it. To hold the TV to my lips, the air so packed with hair. The gator flies the stairs and drop it in the vacant line. To lose my train of thought and fall into your arms crash. And watch beneath the eyelid every passing by. I belong to the blank generation. I can take it or leave it each time. I belong to the generation, but I can take it or leave it each time. I belong to the blank generation. I can take it or leave it each time. I belong to the generation, but I can take it or leave it each time.
Blank Generation, as performed live at CBGB with Richard Hell. That was something of an anthem for the CBGB's minded punk rockers of the late 1970s. And by the way, the term blank generation was a bit of an accident. When he was writing the song, Richard had tried to base it on a poem by Rob McEwen called Beat Generation. It was all about some bohemian artsy types back in the late 1950s. Now, Richard knew that his generation, this new punk rock generation, should have a name, but he didn't know what to call it. So he just inserted the word blank. You, as the listener, were supposed to fill in your own adjective, but no one ever did. And Richard's crew have forever become known as the blank generation. Not all CBGB bands had to be from New York. In fact, I'll give you two out-of-towners who made the place their home. When people talk about the birth of punk rock in the 1970s, 98% of the credit goes to New York and London. Another 1.5% goes to Detroit, thanks to guys like Iggy Pop. But then there's that remaining 0.5% that needs to go to Cleveland. Yes, Cleveland. Before things got going in either New York or London, there was this small but extremely vibrant and imaginative non-mainstream scene in Cleveland. One of the groups at the center of this scene in around 1974 and 1975 was called Rockets from the Tombs. They would later split into two more important groups, Per Ubu, who remained very abstract and very arty, and the Dead Boys, who were, I'll put it this way, their debut album was called Young, Loud, and Snotty. They began as Frankenstein, that was their name. But when they heard about what was happening in New York, specifically with Ramones at CBGB, they pulled up stakes and moved east. And once they got there, it was Joey Ramone that made sure they got to play at the club. The Dead Boys ended up getting a record deal and released a series of records over the next decade or so. This includes a live record made, yes, from the stage at CBGB. Here are the Dead Boys from October 2nd, 1977. The Dead Boys, live at CBGB, along with their signature song, Sonic Reducer. By the way, that song, along with the punk rock attitude of the rest of their stuff, made a huge impression on one Eddie Vedder. Huge Dead Boys fan. So you see what I mean? The Dead Boys never became rich, but they sure left their mark on people who would eventually sell records by the millions. Meanwhile, Per Ubu soon made a trip to New York as well. Here's the song that put them on the map with art punks in the 1970s. It's called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo.
Flew off early in the haze of dawn, in a metal dragon lost in time, skimming waves of an underground sea, with some kind of dream world fantasy. Us on a hot circle on a canopy. 25 racing by a bright green sea. Ahead the dim blur of an alien land. Time to give ourselves to strange hearts and dark black spiders twisting in the sky, reaching twisted claws on every side. No place to run, no place to hide, no turning back on a suicide ride. Tar city streets crawling through my sides, and sprouting clumps of mushrooms like a world surreal. This dream won't ever end, and time seems like it'll never begin. 30 seconds in a one-way ride, 30 seconds and no place to hide, 30 seconds in a one-way ride, 30 seconds and no place to hide. 30 seconds over Tokyo, 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 30 seconds over Tokyo. 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 30 seconds over Tokyo.
Cleveland's Per Ubu with 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. They never sold a lot of records, but boy, did they have an effect on people who eventually would sell a bunch of records, people like the Talking Heads. Once word got out that something cool was happening at CBGB, people started coming in from all over. Like I said, the Dead Boys were from Cleveland, same thing with Per Ubu, and there were a bunch of groups who relocated from Canada. We'll look at them in a couple of seconds.
This is the ongoing history of new music. You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music.
Once the CBGB scene got happening in 1975 and 1976, like-minded groups started thinking about relocating to New York so they could grab a piece of the action. One group was Toronto's Vile Tones. They were led by a pretty fearsome dude named Steve Nazi Dog Leckie. Now, there's a legend, and I cannot vouch for its veracity, that when the Vile Tones decided to move to New York, they robbed a gas station along the way to pay for everything. Anyway, once in New York, Steve made friends with another transplanted New York resident, Sid Vicious, who was freshly ex of the Sex Pistols. In fact, Steve once told me that he was with Sid the day he bought the knife that would eventually become the murder weapon in the infamous death of Sid's girlfriend, Nancy Spungen.
Baders used to say that his favorite story concerning the three of us was buying the 007 knife at Playland in Times Square that was ultimately proven to be the weapon that was connected with the death of Nancy, for example. This 007 knife was a particular brand name that you gotten in Times Square, and we bought it at a place called Playland. There was a healthy juvenile obsession with weapons of affliction, and a knife would be the symbol of this. Well, wouldn't you, if you were, drunk and in a famous band and it was looked upon like that. It's not it's like the Stones pissing on a wall that had been done. So you buy a knife. You're in Manhattan. It seems very appropriate. And but the point is the very knife, the 007, is the one that's later identified as the one that was used somehow connected with the death of Nancy. Sid was bathed in banality, and you could see it coming a mile away. You're no more surprised to hear of his death than one is to hear the death of G.G. Allen or Johnny Thunders. It's like, I didn't see that coming, of course. But the boy really did give off the vibe that he really clearly was not for here. He needed to go. I think it's one of those things where, when you're knotted out and you're, on smack, that she could have as easily plunged it into herself and not even felt it, if depending on how much, heroin she's on. I mean, this is a drug used on the soldiers when they've had their legs blown off. Probably didn't even feel it. To think of him actually, plunging the girl he loved with a knife is just too Romeo and Juliet, having known him, to think that he really would have done that. No.
This is one of the best punk rock songs of the 1970s, and it's Canadian. Toronto's Vile Tones with Screaming Fist. The Vile Tones with Screaming Fist from 1977. It was about this time that Toronto became a third leg in a punk rock triangle that extended through London on one side and New York on the other. There began a constant exchange and flow of bands between these three punk rock capitals. New York bands would play Toronto, while Toronto bands would play New York. And where finances and determination could afford it, both cities exchanged groups with the London scene. All you have to do is look at how many times the Ramones played both Toronto and London. Another big Canadian group that decided that they needed to be involved in the CBGB scene was the B-Girls. They were one of the very, very, very first all-female punk bands in the history of this music. They got together in the summer of 1977 and found a home at Crash and Burn, an infamous Toronto punk club that was around for less than a year. They played gigs with the Vile Tones, which helped explain how they also ended up in New York playing at CBGB. But out of all the Toronto bands that moved to New York City, only the B-Girls decided to stay. That's where they made friends with the guys in The Clash and actually opened a few shows for them. In fact, they were the opening act for The Clash when they played that very weird and very violent show at the O'Keefe Centre in Toronto in 1978. Someone thought it was a good idea to book a punk show at a fancy concert venue. The crowd literally tore the place apart. Anyway, the B-Girls also opened for the Ramones and for Blondie, and they got to hang out with Sid Vicious and the Dead Boys and even Andy Warhol. But let's go back to a night in 1977. CBGB actually hosted a weekend called Outrageous Toronto Bands. It was a nice showcase for some of the punk rock talent on this side of the border. The Vile Tones played, another group called the Diodes, Teenage Head was there, and so were the B-Girls. And I just happened to have a recording of part of their set that night. Toronto's B-Girls, live from the stage at CBGB in 1977. This is called Fun at the Beach. Out of Toronto, the B-Girls, live at CBGB during the Outrageous Toronto Bands Weekend in the summer of 1977. The glory years of CBGB was from the middle 1970s through to the early 1980s. The club hosted sets by everyone from the Police and the Jam to Social Distortion and Sonic Youth. And eventually, playing CBGB became some kind of rite of passage. You weren't really punk rock unless you played at least one night at the club. Even Guns N' Roses would make a punk rock pilgrimage to the club. In saner days, it wasn't unusual to see Axl Rose wearing a CBGB t-shirt. There was something kind of, comforting about the place. While New York and music changed, CBGB remained the same. Outside of the occasional change of the awning on the outside, the club looked pretty much as it did when it first opened in late 1973. Even owner Hilly Crystal looks the same, except he's in his 70s now. So, What's going on? That's how we'll wrap things up in just a second.
This is the ongoing history of new music. You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music.
New York is a much different place now than it was in late 1973 when CBGB first opened its doors. Instead of this bankrupt shell, it's back as one of the most important cities in the world. Property values are skyrocketing, including in areas where sane people once wouldn't venture. And that includes parts of the East Village where you could open a club really, really cheap. In early 2005, we started hearing about how CBGB was having problems with the landlord. There were stories about an expiring lease and a new rent that was tens of thousands of dollars higher, $19,000 a month to more than $40,000 a month. Complicating matters was a bookkeeping error that seemed to indicate that CBGB owed more than $100,000 in back rent. Some say it was as much as $300,000 accumulated over 5 years. The landlords wanted their money, and they wanted the club out of the space it had occupied since December 1973. So, who is this heartless, music-hating landlord? This is where it gets kind of complicated. The building where you'll find CBGB is owned by the Bowery Residence Committee, which is an organization that helps the homeless. Remember how we started this two-part program by describing CBGB as being on the main floor of a flop house? Well, that flop house is there, and it's owned by the Bowery Residence Committee. They hold a 45-year lease on the building, and CBGB is the only commercial tenant. And frankly, they would like the space. The board of the BRC includes some high-powered lawyers and financiers, including someone from American Express. There are also some complaints of conflict of interest within the board. Plus, the BRC also has a war chest of $25 million in cash versus Hilly Crystal's declaration that the club made a net profit of only $165,000 last year, largely on the sale of $2 million worth of T-shirts and other merchandise. So, despite their stance as saviors of the homeless, we have this real David and Goliath thing going on with CBGB as David. There were court cases, there were interventions by the mayor, rallies by fans and bands and artists. Even historic preservation groups stated that CBGB was an important heritage site. But then the lease expired on August 31st, 2005. The eviction notice came on September the 7th. Hilly Crystal won't give up, though. As of today, he still keeps booking bands and fighting back. Meanwhile, an offer came from Las Vegas to reopen the club there, but that just somehow seems wrong. Whatever happens in this whole mess, CBGB did its job. It was a hopeless club in a hopeless part of town where hopeless musicians and music fans could come to tear it up and start again because they had nothing to lose. Who knows how things might have turned out for our music had Hilly not decided to relax his music policy in the spring of 1974. Think about it. Technical productions by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.
You've been listening to The Ongoing History of New Music, a Deep Sky production.